right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday night service. And you may not be familiar with the title of the song, but I know you're probably familiar with the tune and the words of the hymn, and that is "He the pearly gates will open." Would you please stand tonight as we open up our service and sing this song? You're like, I have never sung this song before in my life. Well, you'll recognize it once you hear the music. Love divine, so great and wondrous, deep and mighty, pure as mine, coming from the heart of Jesus, just the same through test of time. He the pearly gates will open, so that I may enter in. For he purchased my redemption and forgave me all my sin. Like a dove when hunted frightened, as a wounded fawn was I. Broken hearted, yet he healed me. He will heed the sinner's cry. He the pearly gates will open, so that I may enter in. For he purchased my redemption and forgave me all my sin. In my eventide at twilight, at his door I'll knock and wait. By the precious love of Jesus, I shall enter heaven's gates. He the pearly gates will open, so that I may enter in. For he purchased my redemption and forgave me all my sin. All right, thank you. You may have a seat. Well, as he said, welcome to our Wednesday night service. Pastor Chico is on vacation with his family, and I'm sure he's having a good time and enjoying the family time with them. We do have a few announcements that we wanted to mention tonight that we've been mentioning the past couple weeks, and something to pray about. Our first announcement is that we still are enrolling in the school, so we would love to have more families be part of our ministry here. The Lord has opened the door for us to have even some additional funding to help with new families that are interested in putting their kids into our program. And so, yes, we are enrolling from the 3-year-old program all the way up to 12th grade. That doesn't mean necessarily 12 years of age, all the way up to 12th grade. But we also have a daycare, of course, and they start at 6 weeks old and go all the way to 2 years old. So we have a one-stop shop from 6 weeks old all the way up to 12th grade, and no college yet, but maybe 50 years from now would be down the road. But we do have a wonderful program here, and we'd like to invite everyone to be part of that. So if you're watching from home and you're not sure that you can afford Christian education, but there's something you want, Christian schooling, something you want, you're worried about what is being taught in the schools and how it doesn't align with your home values, then we would love to have a conversation with you about that. Our next thing is, along with that, because our school program is growing, we would like to put an offer out there for more workers. We have people, we still need some help in the day camp. We just almost finished with one person tonight. We praise the Lord for that. So if you've been praying for more workers, I think we have some help coming. We still need some more to finish out the summer, and some of the teachers have been willing to offer some of their time this summer to help out as well. We're very thankful for that. But we also need for this coming school year extended care. As you know, we live in a society today when both parents are having to work. Mom and dad are having to work outside the home. And because of that, they need longer hours at the school here. And so every year, it seems like our extended care amount of students we have in before care and after care, and sometimes both, continues to grow. And so we are needing more workers, more than even what we had last year. And so if you don't mind praying about that. And of course, we need some daycare workers as well. And we would love to have people to join us taking care of these little babies in the daycare all the way up to 2 years old. It's not something that I personally would enjoy. I like working with older kids, but I know the ladies who do work there enjoy it, and it's something that's really needed. And sometimes we ask the question, how early is it to talk to people about the Lord? Well, they start when they're 6 weeks old. They set them up for like Bible time, and they start teaching them about the Lord and showing them pictures and things like that. So, scientifically, I don't know how much is being absorbed at that point, but it's something that they do with the children, and we're thankful for their love for the Lord and their love for the children. But we are still needing some more workers, if you don't mind praying about that. And then we do have a series, I believe, right, Joe? And that series is Message to the Church. Tonight, Pastor Chico wanted us to do a little bit of a different routine because of the July 4th holiday, and he wanted me to talk some about the foundations of our country, which I'll do tonight. But coming back, Pastor Chico will continue with 1 Timothy. Okay, and I believe, is that it, Joe, for the announcements? Oh, and on Sunday nights, Sunday mornings, we've been going through a series, Who is Jesus? And this is the studying in the book of John. And so Pastor Chico will continue with that series this coming Sunday. Okay, we do have some prayer requests and some online requests that we will take a look at after the service. But if you don't mind taking your Bible now and turning to Isaiah chapter 33, we'll start our service off today. So Pastor Chico gave me the commission to talk a little bit about the foundations of our country. I love history. I was interested in history really before documentaries came out, that they've added to the excitement. I love watching some historical documentaries about our nation. I love this country. I love the foundation of our country. As you watch the documentaries, and maybe you are a person that loves history as well, you will notice that there are times when the country has not acted in the right way, but we do believe that there has been times when they have, and also that our country was founded on Christian principles. There's no doubt about it. You can look back and see that, and we'll touch on some of those things today. But I love history. I started really getting into history and learning about American history through stamp collecting. And so I asked my father one day, I said, can we start collecting stamps? These are before the peel and stick ones, can we start collecting stamps? And he said, sure. Little did I know that he had a stamp collection and my grandfather had a stamp collection. So you have these 3 generations of stamp collections. And the stamp collection book that I had would have the black and white picture of the stamp. You would get the color one, and then you would put it on top of that spot. And underneath would be a brief paragraph about why this stamp was published, or the significance of this person, or the significance of the event, or significance of the place that's being depicted on the stamp. And so I started really just thinking about these things. And along the way, I started learning more about the foundations of our country. But then I went off to Bible college, and one of the things that we learned is the history of Christianity in America. And that history of Christianity, of course, because our nation was founded on Christian principles, is closely tied together and joined. You cannot separate those two. And so in learning about the Christianity in America, I learned more about the history of our country. And then when I first started in education, one of the very first classes I ended up teaching was American Republic. And specifically, I taught from the colonial times all the way to the Civil War. So that's my wheelhouse, colonial times to the Civil War. And it's taken a lot of extra effort to tell you presidents after the Civil War and to learn those before my lifetime. But specifically, that period of time and how things came together and how colonies then became states and how our country was founded is something that I really enjoyed learning. And I taught that for over 10 years to the students of the school here. So, with that being said, one of the things I wanted to focus on, or the main thing I wanted to focus tonight on, is freedom of religion. Now, we take it for granted, of course. Today, we enjoy great American freedom and religious freedom. Just this week, for example, I talked to others about the Lord freely. I conducted a Bible study on the disciples of Jesus Christ. I have a weekly Bible study on that. I send verses of scripture to others by email and by texting. I carried my Bible to church. I attended church services. And I did all those things without ever even thinking once about being arrested or thrown in jail or anything like that. And often, those of us who know the Lord and we take advantage of these freedoms that we have, we take that, if we're not careful, we take for granted that we have these in America. But I want you to know that this was not always the case. In 1651, Obadiah Holmes, John Clark, and John Crandall, three men, were all arrested in Massachusetts Bay Colony for the horrible crime, and this is really horrible, of having a church service outside of their local church. So they all were arrested just for having a church service outside of the local congregational church. They were given exuberant fines, 30 pounds and 20 pounds, which apparently was quite a bit. I don't know the translation of that, but it was more than what any normal person could afford. And so they were given these fines, and they were told by those in charge of the colony that they really should just be brought out into the streets and killed for having a church service outside of the church of that town. So John Clark and John Crandall had, I guess, friends who raised the money, and they paid off their money, and they were free from prison. But Obadiah Holmes thought that would not be the right way to go, and that he needed to suffer for the Lord. So sorry, Joe, I think he messed you up there. On September 5th, 1651, Holmes was taken out to the town, into the center of town where they had a whipping post, and he was given 30 lashes with a 3-corded whip. 30 lashes on his body. Writing later about the event, Holmes related, saying, "Having joyfulness in my heart and cheerfulness in my countenance, I told the magistrates who were whipping me, 'You struck me as with roses,'" because he had such the peace of the Lord upon his life. He wrote on later on to say that when he was in prison, he was worried, of course, about the punishment that would be exacted upon him the next day, that the peace of God came over him, and the pain that he would have endured with the whipping of the magistrates against him, he says he didn't even feel it because God's presence was so real. Now, we don't have time to go into all the background to this, but Henry Dunster was a man that was there witnessing this beating of Obadiah Holmes and this horrible beating that they had given him and made an example of. He was actually the second president of Harvard University, and the significance of that is he had two things. He had the largest library in America, and he had one of two printing presses in America. And he, like Paul, who watched Stephen being martyred, came to conversion in Christ, and he spread the gospel of Jesus Christ during that time as well. But Dr. Clark, who was one of the men who was allowed to be released from prison, wrote that in many days, if not weeks, Obadiah could take no rest, but he would have to lay upon his knees and elbows, not being able to suffer any of his body touching the bed where he laid. And much later, Rhode Island's Governor Joseph Jenkins said, "Those who have seen the scars on Mr. Holmes' back, which the old man was wont to call the marks of the Lord Jesus, have expressed the wonder that he should live." Now, this sounds like something that is straight out of modern-day China or North Korea, but this actually happened in America. And one of the things that we'll learn about today is that those who fled religious persecution ended up becoming the persecutors. So today in America, we don't have that. If I were to have a church service outside of the church here, and the fact that there's many churches besides just one church in Wilmington, Delaware, that there's not going to be some retribution that would involve physical abuse. There's not going to be. Now, years from now, that may be the case, right? We don't know. But in today's society that we live in, no one had to worry about coming here. This is not true in other countries. There's many Asian countries where people are persecuted. In North Korea, they'll hold up something that looks like a Bible and they'll say to the kids in school, "This is a Bible," and this is, obviously something that is very dangerous and something that no family should have. Have you ever seen this in your parents' bedroom before? And that type of thing. And they'll ask them that question. And if any of them respond yes, not knowing that they are being deceived, they actually come home to find a house that is empty. Their parents are taken away to hard labor camps or even killed. In China, they're not allowed to have any copies of the scripture whatsoever. And it's to the point where I've even heard tales of some of the Chinese Christians are exhuming the bodies of loved ones that they knew that were Christians because they were buried a lot of times with the Bible on their chest. So they're even willing to dig up their ancient relatives so they can have a copy of the scriptures. So, and these are just a few examples. And then we have many countries in the Middle East that are also closed off to the scriptures because of Islam. And there's great persecution that's given there. And there's persecution all around the world, even in some European countries. So we have to understand that today in America, we enjoy these religious freedoms. For how long, we don't know. But none of you had any kind of fear about coming together to congregate. Well, before we get into all the reasons to that, I wanted to go back to man's relationship with God. And that is how man sees the need to worship God and how God has given us proofs that he does exist. Well, the first argument for God is the argument of the universe. And simply stated, this means that there's evidence in this world here that we live in and around us that shows us that there has to be somebody that put all of this in motion. The Bible talks about this in Psalms chapter 8 and verse 3 and 4, where David writes, "When I consider the heavens and the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him?" So when we take a look at the stars and see the night sky, it's just mind-boggling. It's baffling to us. It's beyond our comprehension that this whole universe exists. We would be fools to say that it all happened by accident. Now, the universe argument starts like this. Premise number one: whatever begins to exist has a cause. So everything around us that's existed has had some cause for it to come into existence. I mean, even we had parents who brought us into existence, right? But we didn't walk in today and we didn't look at these pews that are in here and think that they just appeared somehow, or that there was some type of explosion and the explosion then brought something into order. I mean, some of you that work in construction or are involved in demolition, you know that explosions never bring anything together in a more organized fashion. It always becomes destructive, right? How many of you watched Veterans Stadium being brought down? I actually was in Tennessee when that happened. I was watching and I was like, boy, this was a place of a lot of memories, whether good or bad. Whether good or bad. And Veterans Stadium, section by section, we just went all in a circle. And when it was done, it just was a pile of rubble. It didn't become something better, So this argument that things somehow the origins of the universe created this design that we have is not valid. But atheists would agree with us that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Number two, the universe began to exist. They would agree with that too. And so the conclusion is, therefore, if whatever begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And we know that to be a person, and that's the Lord Jesus Christ. Job also talks about this as well. It says in chapter 9, verse 9 and 10, "God alone spreads out the heavens and treads upon the waves of the sea, which makes Arcturus, Orion, and Pleiades, and the chambers of the south, which doeth great things past finding out, yea, and wonders without numbers. So the fact that we have this universe is a proof that there's a God. Number two is the argument of order. Now, just because you have a universe doesn't mean that things are going to flow well together. But this universe has order to it. We have the laws of gravity and the laws of thermodynamics, and we have the laws of planetary motion and laws of mathematics, and you fill it in. There's order everywhere. Even if you look at some plants and seashells, they all have order in them. There's order. It's not chaos at all. There's order behind it. And so the fact that this universe has order means that there's also a God. The Bible tells us in Acts chapter 14 and verses 15 to 17, Paul says, "And saying, Sirs, why do you do these things? We also are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that you should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all the things that are therein, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven, and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness." The seasons and the order of the universe is from God, and God put it all together. David also says in Psalms chapter 19, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard." But the third argument for God is the argument of man. And that is that when we look at ourselves as intelligent, living beings who are separated from the rest of the organic plants and animals on this earth, that there has to be someone that created us. Now, even as of, I guess, maybe, I don't know, maybe up to 25 years ago or a little bit longer than that, they believed that our bodies had 70 vestigial organs, meaning that they were just carryovers from evolution. They now have found a purpose for, the last I checked, 66 out of those 70, and I'm sure they'll find the purpose of the last 4 very soon. All of our bodies are put together when we're healthy and there's no flaws, are put together in a way that is just amazing, how it all functions together. And the more that we learn about our bodies, and the more that medicine is advanced, they find more and more and more how special and how intricately created our bodies are, and how it all is put together. David once again talks about this argument. He says, "God, the one that planted the ear, shall he not hear? And he that formed the eye, shall he not see?" And Paul also mentions in Acts chapter 17, "For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring. For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone or graven by art and man's device." And Paul talks about this also in Romans chapter 1, of how people have left and have disregarded these arguments that clearly show the existence of God, and have trusted in themselves foolishly. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. For God has showed it unto them, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like a corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever." And so, as Charles Spurgeon said, and I agree with him, this Victorian preacher, he said, I am persuaded that men think there is no God because they wish there were none. They find it hard to believe in God and go on in sin, so they try to get an easy conscience by denying his existence. And so, what is man's relationship with God? Well, man is designed to worship his creator. And so this is where religions come in. But what's happened is that people changed the truth into a lie, and they've worshipped all these animals, and they've created these religions out of the vainness and foolishness of their hearts. So tonight, when we talk about religion and we talk about faith, we're talking about the Christian one, even though we know that there's other religions out there that we would consider to be false. Well, the known world during the time of Christ and even before there was becoming very organized. Roads were built, sciences were discovered and flourished upon, aqueducts were formed. There was even a central currency and coin system that would impress the current Caesar's face on the coin. When you look at the Greeks leading into the Romans, there was a lot of culture that was there. Now, were they godly people? No. And they were pagan. They worshipped a whole host of gods and goddesses. But there was some type of culture that was presented there. Now, it's amazing then that after that time period, and the Catholic Church became powerful based upon the errors that were being taught, based upon twisting the teachings of scriptures and teaching error, that the Catholic Church actually became so powerful that they led the world from all of this enlightenment about science and sciences and maths and everything into what we call today the Dark Ages. The currency system was abolished. In fact, it was a barter system. I mean, if you can imagine, for thousands of years that all this took place, and people were brought back into these ages where they couldn't even read. They couldn't understand basic truths and so on. And so because of this, the Catholic Church became very powerful. And whenever you talk about the Catholic Church, you talk about the fact that the Pope controlled Europe and a lot of part of the world. If you think about, and I haven't done too much study into it, the Pope himself was willing to coerce and was able to coerce nations who had issues with each other to come together and to have even these crusades into the Jerusalem, Judean area. Even to lead some crusades, just children to go down there and lead crusades, just by writing declarations and saying this is something we need to do. So today we look at countries as being very powerful, and the religions in those countries sometimes not as much, and sometimes they are the same. But when we take a look at this time, the Pope or the Catholic Church controlled a lot of the state's actions, even to the point where we even find out about the Pope. One of the popes tried to get Spain to fight against England, and that was the whole Spanish Armada ordeal that was going on. So when we get to when we start to get out of the Middle Ages, we come to King Henry VIII, and he's known for two things, and I'm sure you know what those things are. And that is, number one, King Henry VIII is known for divorcing his wife, killing the other ones, but divorcing his first wife, and number two, divorcing himself from the Catholic Church. So Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon. If you don't know where Aragon is, it was in Spain. And of course, Spain was highly controlled by the Catholic Church and by the Pope. And so was England at that time. And so Henry VIII wanted to have a divorce. He had fallen out of love with his wife. I'm not condoning this. He had fallen out of love with his wife, who he was married to for 20 years. And his eye had drifted to her handmaiden, who was a lady named Anne Boleyn. And he wanted to have, or he was currently having, an affair with Anne Boleyn. But the Catholic Church would not grant him that divorce. Now, this is not the type of guy that was a real passive, okay, this is what the Catholic Church says, I'll just follow it. He was very much a maverick. He was very much a person that did not ever want to be told no. He just kind of did his own thing. So he declares himself the head of the church instead of the Pope, so that he could get his own divorce. And so the Catholic Church in England then became the Anglican Church. And I'm sure people have heard that before. And basically, there's a lot of similarities between them because, once again, they're just an offshoot of the Catholic Church. But the main difference is the Catholic Church is controlled ultimately by the Pope, but the Anglican Church is controlled by whoever the monarch in England is. And so even today, Queen Elizabeth II is the leader of the Anglican Church. And so King Henry VIII was the one who started that. Now, it's just horrible what happened, and you can see how sin takes you to a place where you don't want to be, because Henry VIII, as he progressed through all these different women, just got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. But he is known for doing this and for establishing his own church. So, as time progressed, we get to the 1600s. There are two groups of people who are very concerned about what is going on in the church. The first group that is concerned is a group called the Puritans. And the Puritans are very concerned about the fact that they believe there's unsaved people in the church, that some of the practices are not godly practices, that they want to be able to, for more people to understand the scriptures. And so there are things that they have a problem with, and they want to change those things in the Anglican Church. But once again, the Anglican Church is controlled by the monarch, who has great control over the country. And so the reason why they're called Puritans is because the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England. That was their cause. So they were not willing to just, toss it aside, to jettison it. They believed that there was still some value in this church that they had, but they thought that they could have some types of reform, and that they could reform the church within and make it to what it should be, more aligned with the scriptures. Now, the second group was a group called the Separatists. And just like the Puritans wanted to purify the church in England, the Separatists said, it's over, it's done, there's nothing good in this church. This is the unclean thing. They use strong words like, it's the whore of Babylon. It's all these things. We separate ourselves from this church, and that's why they're called the Separatists. And both these groups are going to be intricate in the founding of our country, and both these groups are going to be intricate in establishing religious laws, or being the cause for religious laws for freedom. And so the first group to come to the New World was a group in Jamestown, and it was 600 men. And this is the first English settlement in 1607. These are got all our history here, right? So in 1607, the first English settlement was in, it was Fort James, which later became Jamestown, named after James I, who was the reigning monarch at that time. Seeing them travel to the New World, and they had a very horrible time. They had a starving time where 600 men were reduced to 60. And eventually the women came in 1611, and they were able to repopulate and start their colony again. But as time progressed, there was another group who had a very difficult time with practicing their faith in England. They were persecuted. They were put in jail. They were, I consider, to be tortured. They had lots of things that were done to them. And these group of separatists decided to go to Leyden, Holland, and flee for refuge there. So they went to Leyden, Holland, and in Leyden, Holland, they were known for being hard workers. And as I read articles about them and read historical accounts, they just sound like they were like the Amish people. They're just very good at working with their hands, very good craftsmen. They were very hard workers. They had a moral sense of code to them, whereas people that lived in Holland at that time didn't really have that moral code, and they were just involved in every kind of sinful activity they could be possibly involved in. But they were known, like, if I'm going to hire this person, it's going to be a good thing. And so they flourished there. But they wanted to get a transport. I forget the exact word for it. They wanted to get a transport by ship to the New World. And of course, that was very expensive. Now, why they did not stay in Holland is because they were seeing that their children were being corrupted by the people living in Holland, And so they were like, look, we need to remove our families from this because we don't want this ungodly influence. And so to make a long story short, we know these people to be the pilgrims. They came over on the Mayflower and they came to the New World. Now, they thought they were going to Jamestown, and they were greatly and mistaken and shocked to find out that they ended up in a place that we know today to be Massachusetts. And so they arrived in the fall, and that was not enough time, excuse me, they arrived in late summer. That was not enough time to establish gardens and so on if they were going to go down the coast. So they did what they could, even in that short amount of time, just to survive. But they realized that they couldn't go down the coast to Virginia. They had to stay where they were. And so these pilgrims, or the group that we call pilgrims, they call themselves separatists, started a colony that we know today to be Plymouth Colony. Has anyone ever been to Plymouth Colony? Okay, a few people. Well, whenever you talk about Plymouth Colony, you usually hear about a place where they first stepped out, and that's Plymouth Rock, right? But if you ever go to Plymouth Colony searching for this, like, huge, enormous rock that they brought their ship alongside and went outside this rock, you're greatly mistaken. It's like in a crate in the ground, and it's about that big, this rock. And it was a lot bigger, but over the time, like, they tried moving it a couple times, and it was split in half, and, and people wanted souvenirs, so they chisel off a piece, this kind of thing. So it ended up being just this little tiny, rock. I mean, there's rocks at the ball field that are a lot bigger across the street here than that. But this is where they set up, and of course we don't have time to go into how God's providence was there, and how they met a young Indian man named Squanto who miraculously could speak their language. That's for another story. It's just an amazing story of God's providence and everything involved with it. But these Puritans established. Now, once they were established, other people said, "Hey, this is a great place to go." But the people who followed them were not separatists. The people that followed them were Puritans, and they had, of course, more of a backing. They usually were more wealthy because they were tied into the church. They usually were people who had more notable offices, whereas the Pilgrims would be your labor, blue collar workforce. The Puritans were the white collar, aristocrats and people that were involved in legal matters and lawyers and so on. And so they had more wealth and so on they came. So they came to Massachusetts also and set up different colonies. And what we know to be is that these little colony circles here and here and here eventually all came together to be Massachusetts Bay Colony, which we know to be Massachusetts. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, the Puritans also left England because they were being persecuted now. But when they got to the New World, they themselves ended up persecuting others. It was in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, specifically in Salem, that Roger Williams, and we'll learn more about him later, but Roger Williams was excommunicated from the colony and banished, basically a death sentence, especially during the winter time. But it was also a Massachusetts Bay Colony that Obadiah Holmes and John Clark and John Crandall were put in prison because they were having a church service outside of the established church. So these people who left the old world to come to the new world because they wanted religious freedom ended up persecuting others. Now, the reason for that is because the Puritans believed that they were a New Testament version of Israel. And so even to the point when when they came to the New World, and eventually over time the Indians kept on moving away from the coast, they believed that God was driving the Indians out of the land, just like God drove the Amorites and Amalekites and the Jebusites and all those out of the land when the Israelites went in. See, the Puritans believed that they were Israel. And so they wanted to establish laws, and out of zeal for God, that you could not have any kind of practice outside of what they deemed acceptable, because they didn't want the colonies to be tainted in any way. After all, they just braved an ocean to come to the New World. They didn't want there to be any issue or anything that would cause harm to their colony. And so they established these churches in specific areas, and they said you had to go to this church. This is the only place where you go. Well, what's going to happen? If you force everybody in the whole town to go to one church, is everybody in that town a saved person? No, but they're all coming to church because they're forced and coerced to. They didn't have religious freedom. You had to go to this town. Now, would they preach from the scriptures? Yes, they would. In fact, John Winthrop, one of the governors, one of the governors at the beginning of Massachusetts Bay Colony, preached this famous sermon about that this colony will be a city upon a hill. It will be something that others will look at to say, we want to do it this way. We want our colony to be like this. But unfortunately, because they said that things could only be done their way, there ended up being persecution. Well, one of those people we talked about was Obadiah Holmes. Another person was Roger Williams. And in 1635, Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony because he was outspoken about against the harm of those that were for not following what the established church said, and also, and this is key, the confiscation of Native American lands without paying them for it. He believed that, yes, if the colony wanted to expand, then that's fine, but we needed to pay the Indians and say, would you be willing to accept this offer and then take the land that basically a sale. The people in the colony didn't see it that way. They said there had already been some wars, quote unquote wars, which were more like, battles. And they were like, no, we're just going to take over this land because it's ours. And Roger Williams believed the Christian thing would do was to pay them for their land if they were willing to accept a price for it. So because of those two reasons, they were very upset and they banished him from the colony. Now, once again, how bad is it if someone says you can never come back to the state of Delaware? Well, it is what it is, right? We got 49 other states to choose from in the whole world. But you have to understand there are very few colonies set up, and being banished from your colony during the wintertime without grocery stores, places to live, anything like that, that's a disaster. Would you agree? It's a disaster. And basically they were saying, we don't want to kill you and cause a riot and stirring things up. We'll let you die from natural causes. That's basically what it was. So the Indians whom he loved and whom he had witnessed to and whom he had tried to get the colony to pay for ended up taking him in for a while. And when he got on his feet, he established a colony called Providence Colony because he believed that God had providentially spared his life and allowed him to establish a spiritual center. And so this colony, Providence Colony, ended up becoming the state that we know today, Rhode Island. But it was in Rhode Island, in Providence, Rhode Island, that the First Baptist Church was started by Roger Williams. Obadiah Holmes also became a pastor there for 30 years. And it is there that Roger Williams wrote a lot of his writings about religious freedom and the need for religious freedom. See, now why is this important? Because the founding fathers would base some of their writings off of what Roger Williams wrote in this colony. Now, other colonies, of course, were started for religious freedom. We have Pennsylvania, good old Pennsylvania. How many are from Pennsylvania? I know I am too, all right, even though I live in Delaware currently. And Pennsylvania was started as a holy experiment. It is, of course, translated to be Penn's Woods. William Penn was a Quaker. He, too, was being persecuted in England. His father was a war hero, and he himself, who grew up in very rich, affluent family, was a childhood friend of Charles II. And he asked him, because this great amount of money and this payment was owed his father, he asked him if he could have it in the form of land. And so Charles II wrote him out a parchment of land, which is a very big parchment. If you consider Pennsylvania is really big. Can you imagine someone just saying, here, you can have this? The whole state, and Delaware, by the way, a good portion of Delaware, actually where we're standing today, was actually Pennsylvania at one time. So so he gave him this land. And so William Penn is going to be very much an advocate for religious freedom, and we're going to have a whole host of people come to this area. We're going to have Quakers come, which is why we have so many remnants of Quaker buildings, in this area. And also the Jews are going to come for their religious freedom, and even some Catholics. Well, then we have Maryland, and Maryland was started by the Catholics because they were being persecuted too in England. So, depending upon the king, just like we have Republicans and Democratic presidents, they had Protestant and Catholic kings and queens. And whoever was the Protestant or whoever was the Catholic, they would persecute the other side. So if it was a Catholic king or queen, they would persecute the Protestants. If it was a Protestant king or queen, they would persecute the Catholics. And so at this time, the Catholics were like, hey, we need religious freedom too. So they come and they start the colony of Maryland. So in this area that we live was largely affected by people searching for religious freedom. Well, that brings us to the colonies. Eventually, all these colonies that were started by different groups of people become one underneath the country of England, and it's broken up into 13 different parchments, and that brings us to the Revolutionary War time period. Now, before this, and like I said, unfortunately, we didn't have time to go through this. A Congregationalist in the early 1700s named Jonathan Edwards was the lead spark for what we call the Great Awakening. And he's going to preach a very fiery sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And people were so convicted that they literally were holding on to the pews in front of them and their knuckles were white. They couldn't wait till the end of the sermon to get and to become believers. And so there's going to be this great spiritual awakening. Remember what I said, how people, they had to go to church, right? So there's going to be this great spiritual awakening now where people who, the churches were just full of unsaved people and unsaved ministers are now coming to know Christ. And because of that, there's this great pouring out to even witnessing to the Indians and sending missionaries abroad. A person like Adoniram Judson went to Burma. You know, all these different people are being sent out because they too have a love for God. And by the way, Christian education always grows whenever there is revival. And so if we were to see revival in our area, there would be a love for Christian education. Now, I'm not saying, and there's a lot of confusion here, that that's necessarily Christian schooling. Christian schooling is part of Christian education, but sending out missionaries and people attending church and people wanting to tell other people about Jesus, all that comes from spiritual revival. And when revival happens and people get their own hearts right with the Lord, they can't wait to tell other people about Jesus as well. So this great awakening is well known in history, and it is going to greatly affect the northern colonies as we know them. Well, after their spiritual hearts were healed, they started wondering about if they could also have physical freedom, because their own spiritual freedom, yes, was important, but they wanted more than that. And that led to the pulpits all across America, from Georgia all the way up the coast to Massachusetts, wanting to preach from the pulpits that we needed to be free from the bondage of England. Now, you can argue all day long if that was proper to preach on a Sunday morning. A lot of times churches were used for the news of the week instead of just turning on TV or reading a newspaper. But they desired to tell people, look, you can not only have spiritual freedom, you can have physical freedom as well. Now, that's important because today, the way our country is, there's more and more of a call against having anything from the pulpit that has to do with, our country. People don't like that, or they want to bring action against the church if they were to say anything. But we'll get more on that in just a moment. So, as we go through this, Roger Williams basically just had 2 points that he thought were important, and the first one, let me get to it. The first point he had was freedom of conscience as God's will. That he called it soul liberty. That meant that if you were going to have religious freedom, that you had the liberty to worship God however you want. Now, this may sound odd to you because we think as Christians, and we believe correctly, that if we're going to worship God, that we should only worship him the correct way, and that we should worship him for who he is. But Roger Williams, even though he was a believer, advocated that there should be no law against anybody wanting to worship God. So he did not maybe necessarily include this in his writing, but so if a person was Islamic and they wanted to worship, or a person was Hindu, how they wanted to worship, then that would be okay. Now, once again, that sounds odd, right, to say that, because we know that people who do not accept Jesus Christ as their Savior are not going to go to heaven. But here's the thing that Roger Williams understood, that anytime the state gets involved in saying this is how only someone can worship, it always leads to disastrous consequences. So his novel idea was to say, yes, let's preach the truth, let's preach the gospel, but people need to be able to worship how they see fit and how they please. Now, when we get to a perfect kingdom, as we have the millennial kingdom coming one day, there's not going to be that option. And the reason why is because there's only going to be one ruler, and who's that ruler? Or the main ruler is Jesus Christ. And guess what? He's perfect. But before that time, we have to live under imperfect people, and we exist among imperfect people because we're imperfect too, right? And so therefore, if we were to say, hey, listen, the only church that you can go to is an independent Baptist church in the state of Delaware, that's not really religious freedom. The religious freedom is giving people the option to worship God how they please, however they define him, even though it's not necessarily right, or it's not right at all. Because here's the truth that you need to understand, and something that the Puritans had to know. Once you start putting restrictions on other people, guess what happens eventually? They put those religious restrictions on you. So that was his first main point, is freedom of conscience, that you have sole liberty to worship. The second thing that that he brings out, it's my sheet here, is that any kind of religious intolerance always leads to war. And he cited Europe's long history of wars and divisions, and he pointed out that if you are coerced to worship in a certain way, that inevitably always leads to persecution and always leads to bloodshed. Well, we're going to have to stop there. I could go on to some modern day things, which maybe we'll have a part 2 maybe in the future, leading up here. But there's a couple points I want to end with, and that is, number one, even though there's an opportunity to worship freely, that does not mean that God is accepting of other faiths. One of the things that right around the founding of our country, there was an enlightenment period, and there's 2 false teachings that came out of that. One is deism. Deism is the belief that there's a God, and he created the world and put it in order, but that he has no dealings with mankind. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, they were all well-known deists. And so Thomas Jefferson, he was even known for taking his penknife out and cutting out any kind of miracle out of the scriptures because he didn't think that was possible for God to do those things. That's obviously a false teaching. And deism is just one step away from atheism, which is what we have today. The second thing is Unitarianism. And Unitarianism is basically based upon 2 tenets, that God is the Father of all, and we are all brothers and sisters. Now, if I were to tell you that, then you would say, I agree with that. I believe that God is the Father of all, and I believe that we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. But that's not how they define it. What they're saying is that God is the Father of all. In other words, he's accepting of any kind of religion. And if you have like that classic wheel illustration, if you believe in Allah or you believe in some of the Hindu gods, that you all go to the same place one day. It doesn't matter. All roads lead to Rome. All spiritual pathways lead to God. That's Unitarianism. And that because of that, even though you may be a atheist and you may be a Hindu and you may be Islamic or Muslim and I may be a Christian and this person is a Jehovah's Witness and this person is a Mormon, we all come together because we're all brothers and sisters in God. And that's not true. And so today you see a resurgence of this. I was even looking at a church down the street here. I was reading their website, and they basically said this. We're all brothers and sisters of God, and so on. And they're like, we're accepting of all the gay people in any religion and anything like that. That's not scriptures. So even though there's opportunity to worship God as we have in our country now, religious liberty, that does not mean that God is accepting of other faiths. We need to be very clear about this. And we have a mission, the Great Commission, to tell other people about Jesus. Jesus says in John 4, they that worship God must worship him in spirit and truth. And in Ephesians, there is one body, one spirit, even as you are called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through and in you all. Number 2, church and state separation does not mean that they cannot coexist. It simply means that they cannot govern each other. So the idea that our founding fathers had, and once again we had to skip this part because for the sake of time, was that the Catholic Church or any church would not be in charge of the state, the United States, and vice versa, that the United States would not be able to direct any kind of laws against the church, so that one is not on top of each other. It does not mean that they can't exist side by side, and we find that to be true. I mean, think about all of the monuments that have scriptures on them. Think about all of the actions by our founding fathers who fell on their knees and prayed to God for providence and for God to direct their pathways and so on. It's only been a recent thing where people have tried to remove God and the commandments from anything that involves our country. But the verse of scripture that has you turn to in the beginning, Isaiah chapter 33, verse 22 says, "For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, and the Lord is our king. He will save us." That verse was used to establish the 3 branches of government that we have today. For the Lord is our judge, judicial branch. The Lord is our lawgiver, legislative branch. The Lord is our king, executive branch. All of these things were founded and based upon the scriptures. So it does not mean that they can't be together. Now, the same people that say you cannot have prayer in public school, you cannot teach about God in public school, have no problem with opening up Congress in prayer. And I'm grateful for that. But how can it be that they can open up Congress in prayer and not have prayer in public schools? So it does not mean, even though it's being defined that way, that they can't exist together. I even went to, what's that place in South Carolina off of Charleston? My mind just went blank. Where they had the start of the Civil War. Yeah, I went to Fort Sumter a couple years ago. And on one of the anniversaries of Fort Sumter, the battle, they even had a general from the army reading scriptures, and they have his Bible there, and it's opened up to the scriptures that he read from. I mean, it's only been a recent thing that people say you can't talk about God and be in office at the same time. The third thing that we should know is that we need to cherish the freedoms we have now. The Bible tells us in Proverbs 23:10 to not remove the old landmark and enter not into the fields of the fatherless. If the landmark is good and true, why remove it? And so we see that today where people are willing to tear down things that are good because it convicts them. Today, a recent research showed that 38% of Americans go to church. And that's any church. It doesn't even mean it's a good church, a Bible teaching church. Just 38% of Americans go to church. 40% of Americans are unchurched. Now, if you don't know what that means, it means they define it as not attending church in the last 6 months. So I guess if you catch them before, right after Easter, before Christmas, so those go like 2 times a year, that they're considered unchurched. And so then the rest of them don't go to church at all and have no plans to. Out of all the cities that are what they call de-churched, and this may be a surprise to you, maybe not, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania was high on the list, meaning that 39% of people do not go to church at all and have no plans on attending church. So that's right around 40%. And the others just go occasionally, and the rest, who knows what church they go to. It could be anything. So the last thing is this, is that the coming kingdom that we have will be a perfect one. And there will be no need anymore, to have these protective laws that we have for religious freedom. Like, now, once again, we can't go into all of it, but there's 16 words in the Constitution and the First Amendment that says this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And recently, the Supreme Court backed up a football coach who was praying before the games and after the games and said, you can't take his religious freedom away from praying, even though it was done on a public school playing field. There was a church in Missouri just recently, Trinity Lutheran, that was trying to receive funds for the rubber mulch on their playground. And the state of Missouri said, you can't use those because you have a school that's connected to a church. And the Supreme Court said overwhelmingly 7-2, yes, you can. You can you can have that. And even most recently in the state of Maine, money is given to the citizens of Maine to choose what school they want to put their kids in. And they wanted to put their funds towards a Christian school, and they said, no, you can't do that. But then the Supreme Court said, yes, they can. And so Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And I know we skipped a lot about what the Founding Fathers said about it, but at least you might have a foundation that there was persecution in our country for religious freedom. And because of that, and because of the writings of these men who suffered this religious intolerance, they were able to form the framework for what our Founding Fathers took to establish the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. So hopefully that was, I know usually I'm a little longer than normal, but hopefully that was interesting to you, and hopefully that gives you an appreciation for our country. All right, so we're going to close the service down at this time and then go to some prayer. We have the Henry family